Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to begin in just a minute. Want to give people a chance to file into our webinar, and I'll make some introductions and we'll begin. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Well, I want to welcome everyone to Getting the Lead Out with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This is our first Speaking of Water event sponsored by Water UCI for 2023. This webinar will focus on the work of the Natural Resources Defense Council's work on the implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, particularly around lead service line replacement, drinking water in California, and it'll touch on NRDC's drinking water work in Michigan and Illinois. Our speaker, I'm delighted to introduce, is Ellen Lee, who is the drinking water advocate at the Natural Resources Defense Council. She provides technical and advocacy expertise on drinking water issues, working to ensure that everyone has access to safe, sufficient, and affordable water. As part of the Safe Water Initiative, her work focuses on engaging and partnering with communities and others to advance efforts to protect drinking water. Ellen Lee joined NRDC in 2017 and has worked on water efficiency, regenerative agriculture, and green infrastructure, as well as other issues. And she holds a degree in biology and international business with a focus on environmental systems from our sibling, UC San Diego. Ellen, it's a pleasure to have you. And before you go ahead and begin your remarks, I just want to remind everyone at the end of Ellen's talk, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. There is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions into the Q&A, and I will go ahead and curate them and give them to Ellen at the end of her remarks. Ellen, welcome. It's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dave, for that warm welcome. So again, my name is Ellen Lee. I am the Drinking Water Equity Advocate at the Natural Resources Defense Council based out of LA. And I'm here to talk to you today about a once-in-a-generation down payment in our nation's infrastructure, the potential we have to address our lead and drinking water challenges, and then just some key considerations to ensure the equitable implementation of these funds to communities that need it the most. So an NRDC study found that 186 million Americans drank water from drinking water systems that detect lead levels exceeding 1 part per billion. And another analysis by NRDC found that there are up to 12 million lead service lines in the United States, while EPA estimates as many as 10 million. Nearly 1 million Californians face increased health risk because they lack access to safe drinking water, and more than 2/3 are disadvantaged communities with significant financial need. Nearly 1 in 5 California schools built before 2010 found lead levels greater than 5 parts per billion, which is the FDA recommended level. And oftentimes, I'm sharing these facts because oftentimes people will point to drinking water crises in Flint or Newark and think that lead is not a major concern in California. And although the information on where the lead service lines are in our drinking water systems is lacking and inadequate, it's been increasingly clear that lead plumbing is a problem across our country, including California. And so now I just want to give like a quick lead 101, and who better to hear it from than Dr. Monahana Atisha, who is the pediatrician who helped expose the lead water crisis in Flint. And we tested this video out beforehand, but it is always risky to play a video in a presentation. So let's see how it's.
When a pediatrician hears the word lead, there's nothing more to say that, but we freak out. We freak out when we hear the word lead. Lead is probably the most well-studied neurotoxins, poisons ever known. We've known about what lead has done for centuries.
I'm a pediatrician, which means I literally took an oath to protect children. I did the research that kind of uncovered the rising blood lead levels in Flint. And when that came out, it was dismissed and denied and attacked by those who were telling us that the water was safe. And when the pediatrician hears the word lead, you can't say anything to reassure us. You just stop what you're doing and you need to learn more, you need to act. Every agency tells us, from the CDC to the American Academy of Pediatrics, that there's no safe level of lead. Lead is a potent, irreversible neurotoxin. It impacts almost every organ system and really every age population. But we worry about the children the most because they're the most developmentally vulnerable, especially children under the age of 6. Once it is in your body and causes that neurotoxicity, it impacts your nervous system, your development. It impacts cognition, which is how we think. So it drops children's IQ levels. It impacts behavior, how kids act, and it can lead to attention problems and behavioral problems, conduct disorders, criminality. So fundamental functionings of a child. Once it is in your bones, it can come back out at future times. If you are, for example, stressed or pregnant or have poor nutrition in the future, it can come back out of your bones and cause that neurotoxicity all over again. There's no good thing about lead. It's not supposed to be in our bodies. But unfortunately, we continue to live with the legacy of lead, be it underneath layers of paint or under soil from gasoline contamination, but also in our drinking water infrastructure. So it is so hard to believe, but we actually have a known neurotoxin delivering the drinking water to much of our nation's infrastructure. It is something we need to act on. It's something that we need to truly respect the science on. We need to move towards primary prevention to make sure that no child is ever exposed to lead.
And so this was sort of my backup slide in case the video didn't work. And just to recap, again, lead is a heavy metal that can leach from old and corroded plumbing and cause serious damages that affects the nervous system, fertility, cognitive ability, and more. And so again, there's no safe level of lead, meaning any level is dangerous. So pure lead pipes, solders, and fittings were banned in the US in 1986, and national regulations for lead testing and treatment in public water systems were established in 1991 via the Lead and Copper Rule. And action by water utilities is required only once the level of lead has reached 15 parts per billion, which is measured at the 90th percentile of all samples collected. So where does the lead come from then? Other than, of course, the lead service lines that are made of lead, there's also lead in solders, goosenecks, pigtails, faucets, and galvanized lines. And just to emphasize the galvanized line piece and explain that a little bit more. So galvanized iron lines, as they corrode, can collect lead particles from upstream sources like goosenecks and lead service lines. And over time, that can enter your drinking water. Galvanized lines themselves can also release lead and contain lead themselves. So we find ourselves with this lead problem in this country. But we have an opportunity with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is a $1.2 trillion infrastructure deal that can address our nation's aging infrastructure. And it covers things like roads and bridges and rails, to lead service line replacement, to power infrastructure. And today I'll be focusing on what bill means for water. And so we'll have $35 billion funneling into the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And $15 billion of that is dedicated specifically for lead service line replacement. So what is a Drinking Water State Revolving Fund? They were established in 1996 amendments of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And essentially, it's a partnership between EPA and the states to help fund infrastructure projects that help water systems achieve or maintain compliance with drinking water standards, protect public health and the environment as well. And through 2019, these SRFs have provided over $41 billion to water systems, and projects include filtration and treatment projects to storage tanks, to consolidation projects as well. So just a little bit more on how these SRFs work. And I think this image here does a really good job of kind of showcasing that. Essentially, Congress appropriates funds to the SRF, and then the EPA awards capitalization grants to each state based on a needs assessment. And the state usually has to match at around 20%, but for the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, there's no match required. And then so this all feeds into the SRF, which pays out bonds and receives bond proceeds. The state also decides what it wants to set aside, and those set asides are used for things like program administration, technical assistance, and more. And so after these set asides, the SRF disperses funds through loans or grants to eligible water systems for different projects. And as water systems repay their loans, the funds feed back into the SRF, and then those are used to make new loans for new projects. So what does this all mean for California? In the 2018 Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey, it reported that California needs over $51 billion in drinking water investments by 2034. And so California expects to receive over $3 billion in 5 years from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And more specifically, in 2022, California received $609 million in funding. $250 million of this is dedicated specifically to lead service line replacement, and $158 million to its general drinking water SRF program. And so this all means that California could receive over $1 billion specifically for lead service line replacement. California's drinking water SRF program is divvied up into a few programs. So there's the base program, there's disaster relief, emerging contaminants, and then also lead service line replacement. And this is the intended use plan, which is essentially a document that governs how the state plans to administer funds. It includes things like what types of projects are eligible, what they plan to use as set-asides for, loan interest rates, principal forgiveness, and more. And this document is prepared annually, and it is submitted to EPA for approval in order for the state to receive its capitalization grant. I wanted to highlight some features of the base program because this program can also be used for lead service line replacement separate from the lead service line replacement program. And so a few features: the loan rate for 2022 was 1.1%. It requires that all funding applicants evaluate feasibility of consolidation. It also emphasizes that disadvantaged communities, the definition of disadvantaged communities. So disadvantaged communities are water systems that serve populations that have less than 80% median household income. And then severely disadvantaged communities are less than 60% median household income. And this is important because DACs, disadvantaged communities, are eligible for principal forgiveness loans, which essentially offer a reduction in the amount of principal an applicant needs to repay as part of a loan, sort of like a non-repayable loan. And just a key point, this is a very key point, I think, in our engagement with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Historically, funds that have to be paid back can leave communities that are disproportionately impacted by aging infrastructure, which also happen to be a lot of low-income communities and communities of color, leave them in debt for decades. And so the definition of a DAC has proven to be very important in some states. For example, in Illinois, the original definition of a disadvantaged community placed a cap on the population size of the community. And so this ultimately limited cities like Chicago, for example, from accessing principal forgiveness for their lead service line replacement projects, even though Chicago is a city that has more lead service lines than any major city in the United States. And so Illinois EPA has since changed that definition to remove that cap. And per bill guidance, 49% of funds must be dedicated to principal forgiveness for disadvantaged communities. And the way the Drinking Water SRF prioritizes projects is that it prioritizes projects that address the most serious risk to human health, are necessary to ensure compliance with the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act, assist systems most in need on a per household basis. And so here's a little, on the bottom here is a little breakdown of the loan, principal forgiveness, and set aside for each program of California Drinking Water SRFs. And so each program has a separate intended use plan as well. So diving a little deeper into the state's lead service line replacement program and its IUP. So one key feature here is that in addition to disadvantaged communities receiving principal forgiveness, disadvantaged areas within non-disadvantaged communities are also eligible. And the way that the State Water Resources Control Board plans to administer this is while also complying with Bill's sort of ratio of the 49% principal forgiveness to 51% loan, is that they will prioritize DACs, but continually assess the availability of principal forgiveness throughout the cycle. And in the funding agreements with the non-disadvantaged communities, they will incorporate eligibility to turn loan components into principal forgiveness for non-DACs that serve disadvantaged areas. Other key features is that it really does encourage water systems to pay for customer side replacement, although it does not require it. And I'll get more into this as well. And then it also allows funds to be used to replace galvanized lines downstream from any lead part, although it doesn't necessarily require this. I also wanted to highlight a few challenges and roadblocks we've seen across all of our state bipartisan law and engagement at NRDC before I dive into the California specific challenges. And so I think some of these may be obvious, some might not be. So first, the lack of technical and managerial capacity in low-income communities or communities of color. So this ultimately limits their ability to access state and federal dollars. Agencies lack cultural competency and understanding communities they serve. Inadequate information sharing and engagement with communities and community residents. Often there are one-size-fits-all regulations and policies. Overall, there's a lack of adequate water sampling data and inventories. And oftentimes there's not enough funding in the form of grants or principal forgiveness, which can, again, put communities in debt for decades. So now to the California challenges. First, we lack an adequate inventory of all of our lead lines, components, and galvanized lines. Here, this is pulled out from the lead service line intended use plan. And we see that there are only 9 lead service lines in California and just over 10,000 lead parts. And I think there are a few issues here. First, it does not take stock of galvanized lines or customer side inventory. And NRDC estimates around 65,000 lead service lines in California, which is a far cry from the 9 in the IUP. And the Division of Drinking Water estimates 560,000 galvanized lines on the utility side. So there's still an unknown amount on the customer side. And so we think this lack of data is very concerning and likely contributes to the lack of urgency for and accountability of water systems to address their aging plumbing that could be leaching lead into our drinking water. But currently, the state board is scoping out a process to conduct an inventory. So both to include an inventory of galvanized lines and then also the customer side, because that's an important piece of not having partial lead service line replacement. And so we believe it's important that the state takes necessary steps to develop a detailed inventory of all the materials used in the distribution system, again, both on the utility side and the customer side. Another consideration is that while California may not be laden with lead service lines as much as other states, galvanized lines can also be a major source of lead contamination in the state. And so in 2016, we saw what happened in Fresno. Fresno residents were concerned about rusty, discolored water coming from their pipes, and we found that they found that nearly 14% of children tested in one Fresno neighborhood had reported high levels of lead. 25% of schools in Fresno reported finding lead coming from their drinking water fountains, and 40 homes had lead levels above the federal limit. And so expanded testing found an additional 300 homes had lead coming from their faucets, and ultimately that led to a class action lawsuit. And so essentially what happened here was Fresno found that lead was leaching into their water through corroding and unwrapped galvanized pipes. And so ultimately Fresno banned the use of galvanized pipes in new construction. Currently under EPA rules, galvanized lines that have been or currently are downstream from a lead service line are required to be removed, but galvanized lines downstream from lead components, which is the goosenecks, pigtails, and fittings, are eligible for funding to be removed via bill, but they're not required. And so this is concerning because galvanized lines downstream from any lead part can pose a harm to human health. And states like Michigan, Illinois, New Jersey have already recognized this risk and require them to be removed altogether. And so our goal at NRDC is to conduct replacements, to ensure that replacements are being conducted in the most health protective manner, and to ensure we aren't being wasteful with our resources, because leaving galvanized lines in the ground is a danger to public health and can be a waste of resources if the state has to dig up the lines again for replacement. So in addition to advocating at the state level, this area of work also crosses over to our federal work with the EPA to include galvanized lines downstream from any lead part as part of the definition of requiring galvanized lines requiring replacement. Another key concern is that we want to ensure water systems fund and provide notice, education, filters, and sampling, like water testing to residents whenever a lead service line is replaced or disturbed. This is important to protecting our residents because there can be lead spikes during any lead service line activity. Bipartisan infrastructure law funds are eligible to be used for these public health safeguards. And the state board recently amended 12 water system permits to require these protections during their planned lead service line replacement activities. However, we want to ensure that we're erring on the side of caution and that these safeguards are provided to all other water systems for both planned and unplanned activities, such as water main replacements or meter replacements and so forth. Last but not least, California must also ensure that water systems receiving funds from bill fully pay for replacement activities without charging individual property owners, to just make certain that socioeconomic factors do not preclude a Californian from having access to safe drinking water. An NRDC study found that the rate of drinking water violations increased in communities of color and low-income communities. Due to things like redlining and environmental injustice, people of color are more likely to live in communities with lead service lines. And moreover, the cumulative impacts of having multiple sources of lead in gas, paint, and more are more severe in communities of color. And so lead contaminated drinking water further contributes to the total harm to human health in these communities. And piling on a financial burden of replacing lead lines and parts would further exacerbate these existing inequities and ultimately result in a partial replacement, as well as continued lead exposure. And what I mean by this is when a resident cannot afford the thousands of dollars to replace their side of the lead service line, this can lead to a partial replacement because the line is left in the ground and there will be spikes in lead. A recent study showcased on the left here in Washington, D.C. also showed that household income and race were major predictors of who was able to fully replace the lead service line. And so bipartisan infrastructure law funds can be used for customer side replacement, and the IUP does encourage that, but it's currently not required. And so that's an area that we're very focused on as well. And so our work in California is very much guided by our lessons learned from cities like Flint and Newark. Just a quick summary, declining auto industry led to population drop in Flint. And so they were cash strapped and shouldering a $25 million deficit. The city was soon turned over to state control. And this ultimately led to the decision in 2013 for the city to end its 5-decade practice of piping treated water from Detroit in favor of pumping water from the Flint River. And so the river water was highly corrosive, and Flint officials failed to treat it, and ultimately lead leached out from old pipes into thousands of homes. And in April 2014, we saw how residents started complaining about water from their taps smelling weird and tasting foul. And despite protests, officials maintained the water was safe. But we found nearly 9,000 children were supplied with lead-contaminated water for over 18 months. And in 2016, a coalition of citizens and local groups, including Flint resident Melissa May is pictured here, concerned pastors of social action, NRDC, and ACLU of Michigan sued the city and state officials in order to secure safe drinking water for residents in Flint. And then in 2017, a major settlement required the city to replace thousands of lead pipes with funding from the state, and also funded comprehensive water testing, filter installation, education, and other programs to help residents deal with the effects of lead-contaminated water. And I think this is a case study. I think this case study is a really good example of the importance of implementation and accountability, especially by the community. The slow pace of the progress from the settlement drew a group of residents and NRDC back to court to demand Flint comply with its obligations to identify and replace these pipes, and then also provide filters for residents. And so the Flint's lead service line replacement work has gone past a few court-imposed timelines, and residents are inquiring about lawn and sidewalk restoration and the status of their home. And so now NRDC is working to ensure Flint funds and fields all those information requests by residents regarding their status, the status of the lead service line replacement in their home. And so 4 key lessons that our team has learned from this is community engagement and collective action are a powerful driver of change. Flint was ultimately discovered and resolved because of its residents. We also learned the importance of building strong partnerships with frontline groups and coupling that with sound science and litigation. And we also learned that, we also found that the federal lead and copper rule was lacking. So we worked with local groups to improve Michigan so that there would be the strongest lead and drinking water protections. But there were still exceptions, like Benton Harbor, for example, which is also another example of the power of community and community engagement in elevating and driving change. Fourth, it isn't just the water that needs to be addressed in Flint and communities like Flint. There are entire systems that have fallen apart and that really need to be addressed, like education, healthcare, and so forth. And this crisis, this drinking water crisis, just made all of the others worse. Another key example is in Newark. So in 2016, there were major warning signs of recorded high levels of lead in schools in Newark. And in 2017, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection required Newark to monitor lead in its drinking water more extensively. And the city found that it had lead levels that were above the federal action limit. And then in 2018 and 2019, the city's levels rose to some of the highest in the country. But through efforts with New Caucus and NRDC, and significant commitment from the city, county, and state, substantial progress has been made since the lawsuit. And by January 2021, Newark was well on its way to remove over 18,000 lead service lines at no direct cost to residents, which is a model for cities nationwide. And so one key thing is also the city provided at-home water filters to about 40,000 households. And some key lessons learned here is, and I think the first one is very true of Flint as well, is the failure to protect public health leads to a loss of trust. And I just wanted to read off one quote from an attorney that worked on this case, is that one of the hardest takeaways from this work is that people can have brand new pipes and still never trust that the water is safe. That's the damage and the lasting lesson in Flint. In Newark, it's not just about fixing the water, it's also about restoring people's faith that the government is looking out for them. So I feel like that was a very powerful message from this work. We also learned in Newark that a lead service line replacement must be designed to address the needs of the community it's serving. So things like sharing resources in the language of the community and providing education in that way. Third is the no direct cost to residents for lead service line replacement can really help accelerate the program as well. And then fourth, also helping renters replace lead service lines can accelerate the progress, accelerate the lead service line replacement progress, and especially in areas with low ownership rates as well. And so these last two pieces were really modeled in Newark in the form of an ordinance that allowed renters to approve lead service line replacement on the property at no cost to them. And so that really helped accelerate the program and makes Newark a very good example of how to do lead service line replacement. So what's next? I kind of divvied this up between local, state, and federal. These are just kind of things that NRDC is exploring and working on. So we plan on continuing supporting education and outreach around SRFs and bipartisan infrastructure law. Very importantly, we want to build the long-term capacity of communities to access the state and federal funding for infrastructure. We support community engagement with local agencies to identify and submit projects, also streamlining those applications. And educating community members on the dangers of lead contamination and the importance of testing, filter safety, and lead service line replacement. At the state level, we plan to continue to engage with the State Water Board and advocate for equitable distribution of bill funds. And this is true of the other states that we work in too. The IUP, the intended use plan public comment period is coming up mid-April for the next year of funding. And so we plan to engage in that. There's an opportunity to amend the SRF policy as well. We want to also ensure that funds are set aside for local technical assistance and really encourage water systems to apply for lead service line replacement funds to make sure that California is addressing its lead service line issue once and for all. At the federal level, we are also very focused, as I mentioned before, on the lead and copper rule improvements. We feel like this is a very important piece of regulation because it will trickle down to all states. So issues like addressing the galvanized line definition, I think will be very important in that venue. I think we are also working to improve bill guidance and sharing lessons learned from the first year of funding. And then we will also continue to seek out other funding opportunities for lead service line replacement, because while the bipartisan infrastructure law is a huge package and really does help lead service line replacement, it will not fund the entirety of lead service line replacement across the country. And that's all that I have, and I'm open to questions. I can drop the slides as well.
Great. Ellen, thank you. Very illuminating talk. Again, for those of you who have questions, please put your question into the Q&A icon, and I'll go ahead and curate them for Ellen. We do have one question, and it's from Joshua Bear. The question is as follows, Ellen. Are there protections in California to mitigate against rent increases as a result of lead replacement? In other words, the landlord passing off lead replacement costs onto tenants?
That's a great question. And it really gets to the customer cost share piece that I mentioned. And so our goal is to make sure that these lead service line replacement costs aren't passed off to customers that can't afford it. So as it is, we're looking into opportunities to incorporate that piece into funding agreements when water systems apply for SRF funding. So making sure that the customer is covered in those aspects. And so hopefully that might help mitigate, but as of right now, there aren't any formal protections. In other states, NRDC is also looking at rate basing lead service line replacement and making sure that it is part of the infrastructure that the water system plans to improve, while also making sure that rates still remain affordable too.
Excellent. And again, please put your questions into the Q&A and I'll read them. Great question from Caitlin. What made you interested in water quality?
Yeah, so when I first started at NRDC, I was actually looking more closely at stormwater enforcement. So sort of like a different form of water quality, more source than at the tap. And so I noticed how kind of intricate a lot of these water quality issues are and how you can find them in various places. And soon kind of got more drawn to the drinking water aspect because of the human component and how drinking water affects our everyday lives. And so that's sort of how I guess I got interested in water quality.
Great. While we wait for other questions in the Q&A, I had a question basically kind of related to the previous one. What long-term lessons for community organizing and activism with regards to water justice do you believe we can learn from your experiences as a drinking water advocate?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And some of these, I feel like these lessons learned were pieces that NRDC specifically learned, and I can't really speak towards the community as on their side, but for us, it was really connecting with the residents on the ground and figuring out how to make lasting impact while also addressing immediate relief. And so, like, how can we look towards Michigan's lead and copper rule while folks were still on the ground drinking lead contaminated water? And so finding that sort of middle ground of traversing that and really connecting with the residents and lifting up their solutions and their needs through the channels that NRDC might have and leveraging those relationships, I think was really important. And so what we've seen again in both Newark and Flint was the power that community residents have and figuring out how to organizing and partnering with frontline groups that were connected to these communities in order to help organize them in a way that built their political power. And so I think specifically around the drinking water work, it really is an environmental justice issue. And so being able to uplift their message and really drive home community-led solutions, I found is a very key principle of this drinking water work.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And I see we have a couple of other questions, one from Sophia. Do you think water quality will be easier or more difficult to achieve in the future in reference to the political climate?
That's a great question. I think there's specifically around drinking water, there's a lot more attention towards it now. I think from the examples that we've seen in Flint and Newark, it's really put it on the map. And so it's an issue that really cuts across all like political borders, right? Like it's an issue that it's a bipartisan issue, and NRDC has had done some polling in a few states in the Midwest, and it's been recognized that drinking water and affordable drinking water is an issue that is top of mind no matter who you are. And so I hope it will be easier for my work, but I guess we will see.
Indeed, we will. And Carol Moore has a question. I am not aware of galvanized line use in Orange County, California. Is that a factor here?
So as I mentioned before, I think California has a lot more galvanized lines than it likely does lead service lines. It is a type of plumbing that has been used in lieu of lead service lines since lead service lines were banned. but then again, we don't know. And so the State Water Board is working on figuring out how to conduct an inventory that does map that out. And so the Division of Drinking Water, again, estimates 560,000 galvanized lines on the utility side. And so what that means is on the property line to the house, that's the customer side. So we have no idea what's on that side yet. But from the property line to the street, there could be a galvanized line there. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a better answer. We're currently trying to figure out an inventory as well. And so hopefully that will help residents sort of be able to understand, you know, where they are and what their lines are and what it looks like in their area.
We have another question from Caitlin. Great question. Besides educating others about water justice, what else have you been able to do with NRDC to help besides the local, state, and federal goals you just mentioned?
So outside of educating, we also strive to change rules and regulations. So one key thing that we have our attention to is the lead and copper rule improvements. And so focusing on things like bringing down the action level of 5 parts per billion, because that's the FDA recommended as well. Ensuring that we are doing lead water testing at the 1st and 5th liter. And what that means is taking multiple samples of water so that we can get a better look into see if there's lead in the premise plumbing, so plumbing in your house, or if there's lead in the service line specifically. And that will help get a better idea of like what needs to be replaced. So expanding testing efforts, expanding education and public health protections as well. And so those are sort of various federal efforts.
Great. And again, please feel free to use the Q&A to place your question, and we'll go ahead and make sure that Ellen is able to answer your question, your issue. I had another question, Ellen, related to the bipartisan infrastructure law itself. People often want to know, now that we have this bipartisan infrastructure law, how long will it be before its impact on improving water infrastructure, especially in underrepresented communities, is felt? Can some projects be accelerated?
Yeah, so I think that largely depends on the water system and their priorities, right? So a water system can apply for funding year one, and based on their readiness and completeness of their application, they could receive the funds that year and start their project as soon as possible. There are other ways to accelerate lead service line replacement, as we've seen in Newark and related to the no direct cost to customers, and then also allowing renters to approve lead service line replacements. And so those two pieces together have really helped accelerate lead service line replacement in that city. And so incorporating those aspects have been something that NRDC is exploring. In cities like Chicago, for example, they have over 400,000 lead service lines just in that city, more than any other city in the United States. And so we're running up against issues like the cost issue, and then also the land ownership issue of like, how do we accelerate this to ensure that renters are also getting lead service line replacement, even though maybe perhaps their landlord isn't approving the project or whatever it might be. So there are various efforts or avenues to help accelerate it. It really largely depends on how invested the water system or the city is in prioritizing lead service line replacement.
Very good. We have a question from Ming Yi, very interesting question about the process of working with communities. Do you face any difficulties when you're employing a community-led method to improve water justice? For example, let's say an irrational request from a local community that is opposed to your expert knowledge or lack of knowledge or awareness. I guess, in other words, are there ever situations where there's a disconnect between what a community might think of as a problem and what you know from an expert perspective as to what is really a problem?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it really NRDC's approach really leans on the Hermes principles. And I think when you're working with communities, it's not a one-way street. We're not telling them what they need to do, but we are providing our expertise and our knowledge and providing education, while they're also giving us information about the background, what the community needs, issues that community residents are facing. And so having this kind of two-way street where we collaborate and really foster true collaboration, where we learn from each other, I think really helps to alleviate those tensions. And I think really building trust too, that's a very important piece. I think I failed to mention earlier, really building trust with the communities that you work in, rather than piloting in and assuming that we know everything that we could possibly know about what's happening in this community. And so I think relationship building is very important, not just to the water justice space, but also to environmental work as a whole. Really building and fostering authentic relationships with the communities you work with and communities you serve.
Okay. Again, please feel free to put your question into the Q&A, and we'll make sure that Ellen has the opportunity to answer it. In your presentation, Ellen, I was thinking about what might be some of the most urgent challenges in terms of threats to safe drinking water in underrepresented communities, maybe that are looming on the horizon, and that maybe you haven't had a chance to address. What might those issues be? And are they solely issues of water quality, or perhaps also of water cost and access?
Yeah, great question. I think issues of water quality, first, they vary from community to community. Some folks are facing lead spikes, some folks are facing arsenic, some folks are facing nitrates in their water. But I think also water cost is a very important piece that NRDC is very focused on too, is the affordability. And I think it couples really nicely with the infrastructure work. Across the nation, we're seeing aging water infrastructure from Jackson, Mississippi to Benton Harbor in Chicago. And so how do we fund this, given that although the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is $1 trillion package, it's not going to fund every possible thing that many cities need. And so there's discussions of rate basing a lot of this infrastructure, but also making sure that these rates don't exceed what an individual payer can pay for. And so kind of spreading out infrastructure costs a little bit are some potential avenues that we're looking into.
Great. And Carol Moore has another question, and I'll go ahead and read it. About 15 years ago, HOAs in Southern California found there was an issue with pinhole leaks in copper lines. It generally was accepted that flux left in the line affected the copper. So HOAs compared the cost of replacing the lines and found that for about half the cost, they could line them. And as the warranty for both replacement and the reline was 20 years, it was an obvious relining that was the choice. Between the two choices, replacing the lines and relining them, is that a more sensible remedy? What do you think? Does NRDC have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we actually had this discussion a few months ago as well. And so the issue with relining is that we would have to go in and do that maintenance over and over again, whereas replacing it once and for all can help resolve the issue, and we won't run into issues of whether the homeowner or the renter is allowing this effort, who's going to pay for it, and so forth. And so we feel like having a permanent solution is better than having one that requires maintenance and watchdogging and accountability and more implementation. Yeah, so that's sort of our outlook on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and a follow-up. Carol mentioned that we were lined in my HOA over 15 years ago. There was no problem. Any thoughts on that?
That's great. I guess I don't really have a comment on that. I think perhaps I could bring this back to my team and we can discuss it a little further.
That'd be great, and we'll get Carol an answer. Had a general question about the urgency of the problems that we've been talking about this afternoon and in your remarks, and given the disproportionate adverse impact on the poor and minorities of lead soldered pipes and plumbing fixtures, why do you think that federal action to rectify this problem has taken so long? Or to put another way, why did it take a Flint to force action?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, it's an interesting story too, because before Flint, there was Washington, D.C., and there wasn't as much news or press coverage on that either. And so I feel like one piece of it is the community's engagement and their power to level this up and drum up press and public awareness about the issue. I think more importantly too is, as it relates to lead, there have been, if we're kind of conducting a root cause analysis of why this problem got so bad, there have been various cities and states that actually codified the use of lead in their water systems. And it was because of the lead industry's heavy lobbying and actually a really well-funded campaign that led to the widespread use of lead service line and lead parts across the nation. And so sort of with themes of like corruption and industry, I think that's why lead has been so rooted in our nation's infrastructure. And a large part of the reason why it's taken so long for the nation to address these issues, even though EPA and the nation has recognized that lead has all these significant harms to human health. I think, in terms of federal action, it took a Flint for folks to recognize because it really put it on the map. We saw how this issue was an environmental justice issue. It was impacting low-income residents, communities of color, and it was perpetuating racial injustice. And so I think that's a big part of the reason why it took that to kind of wake people up.
Great. Well, we have a couple of more minutes for questions, but as we see if there's any more questions in the Q&A, had maybe just a general thought on your part, Ellen. What should we be doing as students, as basically as people interested in environmental justice more generally? Are there things that we can be doing to really draw more attention to this issue in our local communities, to help those that are undergoing water injustice? What are some things in your experience maybe we can be doing better?
Yeah, one thing, and I think this goes beyond just the water space as well. One thing that I think is very important is supporting local groups, so local environmental justice groups, and there are many in Southern California. And it's not just water issues that they're facing. They're facing industry and air pollution. They're facing rising electricity costs and energy costs. And so getting involved with groups like that, and just to name a few that are so well respected in the Southern California space, like Communities for a Better Environment, East Yard, SEHA, so many different groups are working in the environmental justice space beyond just water. And I think a lot of the times these frontline groups are very under capacity, but have so many issues to solve, and they're really on the ground trying to protect their residents. So getting involved with those groups, supporting them, donating them, I think is very important. And just getting involved with your community and figuring out what issues are facing your community, I think is important.
Yeah, great. Open our pocketbooks and our wallets, contribute, donate, attend meetings, talk to our neighbors. As you were mentioning the issues in Southern California, and I think many of the people that are attending this colloquium know, we've had issues with respect to lead in soils, particularly in parts of South LA, from a battery factory that just, not so recently closed. So yeah, very, very true. And the pressures of local environmental groups and the help and the assistance they need. It's great. Yeah,
and just to I guess prop them up a little bit more, Communities for a Better Environment has a toxic tour that they do that I highly, highly recommend. I always encourage NRDC staff to go, and it's always so illuminating. You learn so much. And they tour like Southeast LA as well as the ports of LA as well, and highly recommend getting involved with that too.
Great. If you've got a link for that and you send it to me, I'll make sure that it's posted on our homepage for Water UCI. We'll get that out there. Ellen, this has been really a delightful conversation and just a wonderful presentation. And again, I want to announce the fact that this has been recorded. So this will be around for posterity. And again, just welcome. And thank you for your great remarks and your great response to questions. Before we close, I just want to mention that we do have a symposium coming up by Megan Kung, who's an economist with the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board. It's also on the topic of environmental justice. In this case, stormwater isn't impervious to racism. Opportunities for stormwater capture in LA County. And that'll be coming up in March. Please stay tuned. We'll get that posted on our website, and we'll get some general announcements out there. With that, I want to ask that we please give it up for Ellen. Great discussion and great talk. And we'll have some NRDC folks come later on to talk about some of the other issues you've mentioned.
Thank you for having me, Dave.
It's a pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.